Towards a Spiritualized Society, Auroville, an Experiment in Prefigurative Utopianism. Doctoral thesis by Suryamai Ashwini Clarence Smith. Chapter 8. The Institutional Potential of Prefigurative Experiments. Collective Accounts in Auroville. Quote, "New forms are needed for the manifestation of a new force." The Mother. Throughout the community's history, Aurovillians have experimented with various alternative socioeconomic forms of association that sought to embody the community's ideals, as outlined by the Mother in her statements for how the township would be organized as an economic community, and inspired by Sri Aurobindo's writings on flexible, subjective systems of collective organization. While the preceding chapter explored the development of Auroville's overarching communal economic administration, the current chapter examines economic practices outside of this public sector. These are especially relevant to examine in the context of this thesis, because they have been key to establishing economic institutions within Auroville, and are thus exemplifying enactments of a prefigurative utopian practice. In the first section of this chapter, I examine the development of a series of experiments in common accounts, and in the second, I delve into a case study of a cooperative public service that they prefigured, the Portuguese Distribution Center. The emergence and development of these experiments, from the private sphere to the public, is revelatory of the various levels of political agency that shape Auroville's economic practices and organization, from activist community members to community administrators to government advisors, which is significant in understanding the anarchic nature of its utopian practice. It also ethnographically substantiates the collective theorization of utopian practice that I build on in this thesis, particularly the critical, transgressive, and concrete dimensions of such practice. Additionally, it makes an empirical contribution to the wide-ranging body of work on cooperative economic practices and institutions. Common accounts. The common accounts I examine here came into existence in the early 1990s, following the adoption of the individualized maintenance system, triggered by Auroville's economic relationship with the Human Resources Ministry of the Central Indian Government, recounted in the previous chapter. These were instigated by groups of Aurovillians who sought to contest this development, which they perceived as a critical breach from the existing communal economic organization of the community and from its socio-economic ideals, through the creation of alternatives that enabled them to actively reclaim and enact these ideals. As such, they exercised both what Moylan has theorized as critical utopianism, by challenging developments within their own community, and what Sargison terms a transgressive utopianism, in developing alternative practices that politicized personal spheres to effect change in the public sphere. Although many of these common accounts failed, they were instrumental in prefiguring the community's existing cooperative institutions. This section will describe and trace the historical evolution of these collective accounts in Auroville, highlighting how they have articulated with its founding ideals around economy and community. Introduction: The Common Account. I discovered the practice of common accounts in Auroville at Sunday lunch, at home with my parents. Like in virtually every conversation at a family meal, we had wound up talking about Auroville, a habit that preceded my research, although the latter fomented it. On this particular Sunday, I had expressed concern over economic inequality in our community and was raising questions about how Aurovillians who struggled financially were or could be supported economically. "Well, we had the common account," ventured my mother, Nicole. I had never heard of it. "Who started that?" I first asked. "We did," she answered. "Who's we?" I retorted, thinking she meant Auroville at large. Nicole pointed at herself while saying, "And Peter, my dad. I was taken aback, as I had been many times throughout the course of my research, in discovering ways in which they had been involved in Auroville historically. I was in the financial service at the time, Nicole explained. I created the common account and managed it from there. I asked her how many people were members, expecting it to be a low number, like 12. My parents answered at the same time. 100, said Nicole. 50, said Peter. What did you say? Peter asked Nicole in a tone of incredulous disbelief. 200? 100, she replied, self-assuredly. I think it was more like 70, he countered. 80, she said, conceding, but clearly unconvinced. Nicole explained that they all put money into the common account at the beginning of the month and used the common account for their everyday expenses. Individual usage was tracked, although this seemed to be primarily so that people who, quote, had money would give 10% extra on what they had used the previous month, so as to even out the balance for those who, quote, didn't have money. People who were struggling financially could also come forward to the groups with specific funding requests. An example she gave was an electrical moped, and the group would see if they could support it. I asked my parents whether the shared account was a successful experiment, and Nicole responded, well, we were careful not to include anybody who was known to be financially irresponsible. When starting out, they had approached people they knew, who they thought would be interested. Once established, how did they decide if someone new could join? Nicole couldn't remember. When I asked my parents who were members of the common account, I discovered it wasn't the only sharing account of its kind. Nicole started listing some names, Françoise, Anna Bernard, when Peter interrupted her. Anna Bernard? He questioned. I thought he was in Seed. I'd never heard of Seed either, and said as much. Well, people still don't know it exists, Nicole remarked. It still exists? I exclaimed, even more surprised. Yes, said Nicole. Otto manages it. Does the common account still exist? I asked, now wondering if my parents had been part of some shared account I didn't know about for all these years. No, says Nicole. It dwindled after we left. We started it in the early 1990s. All of a sudden it clicked. From my previous research on Portuguese Distribution Center, the community's provisioning service, I knew that the 1990s had been a time of contested change to Auroville's economic organization. Was it in reaction to the creation of individual accounts that was happening around that time? I remarked, yes, said Nicole, emphatically. Seed, Auroville's oldest common account. I met with Otto in the financial service shortly afterwards to talk about Seed. He told me it was also started in the wake of the creation of the financial service in the early 1990s by a small group who, quote, wanted to do something different, wanted something collective, not an individuated system. We notice here the same impetus, disappointment with a shift away from the collective ethos underpinning the community's economic ideals, galvanized into prefigurative action that reclaimed this. As we will see, the founding ideals around work in Auroville, that everyone in the community would contribute to it through work, but that this would be a practice of spiritual development and not a way to earn a living, Aurovillians' livelihood needs secured collectively, were crucial in informing the raison d'être of this common account. And the ideal of, quote, unity in diversity, which strongly informs how Auroville envisions itself as a community, was key to how it was managed. When Seed was started, there was only one formal requirement for people to join, that the person worked full-time in Auroville, while perceived adherence to the community's economic ideals, as outlined, were critical in securing membership. Just like with the common account, the small group who came up with the idea for Seed approached others who they knew might be interested in doing something different. The vast majority of members, 30 of them, had been there from the very beginning of the fund, and no one had joined in recent years. Otto said it wasn't promoted, in part because 30 was a manageable size, and in part because the most important thing was trust. A trust which the existing members had now built over 30 years. For it to work, Otto said, it was key that there was affinity between people, which I came to understand meant an affinity in terms of their commitment to Auroville's economic ideals. members with no individual savings sometimes required capital beyond the monthly subsistence amounts that they contributed into the account. And when I asked for what kind of expenses, Otto's response was revelatory of how much the existence of the fund was underpinned by Auroville's founding economic ideals. Flight tickets, or maybe something for the house that may not be covered by housing. The issue is that we know a maintenance doesn't cover all the basic needs, and then people are doing extra work for money and neglect what they should do, which is exactly what we didn't want to have happening here, where work is supposed to be a help in one's own development. However, people who had asked to join in more recent years on the basis of being financially strained were not admitted. While the fund did function in a solidary way, including members whose only source of income was the Auroville maintenance, an amount insufficient for many in meeting their costs of living, charity was not reason enough to accept someone. Those driven primarily by financial self-interest were not perceived as sharing the same collective ethos that bound the group. Solidarity with the latter stemmed from a shared sense of commitment to prefiguring the socio-economic ideals of Auroville and a trust that had been built up over time. The administration of the fund was also prefigurative of the flexible, subjective systems that Sri Aurobindo had described for a spiritualized society, and the ideal of unity and diversity that Auroville aspired to embody as in its articulations of community, in this case economic. The account functioned similarly to the common account. Everybody transferred in their maintenance, or more if they had private funds and could afford to, although this was not imposed. They all used individual accounts for their everyday charges, and at the end of each month, seed would cover the expenses of each. Pluses and minuses on individual expenditures relative to their contributions were absorbed by the common account, which had an administrator that kept track of these and addressed any issues if necessary. I decided to meet Arthur, Seed's administrator, to find out more about how this worked. Each person could administer a common account in their own way, he started by saying. We were in the library, where Arthur also worked. Personally, I don't take any risks. I continue to track on an individual basis, he said, a statement that perhaps betrayed the desirability of not doing so, given the community's ideals around collectivism. He only informs individuals, however, if there are major discrepancies between their expenditures and contributions. If they have a big positive balance, I inform them. When people don't have ample means, I inform them if it's positive, Arthur explains to me. Same thing for the negative. I don't tell them they have to reimburse it, I simply inform them. If it continues, I go and meet them to find out if it's due to financial issues. I ask them to reimburse the fund if they can. If they can't, I put their balance back to zero. Not requiring individuals to meet expenditures they were unable to, even if they had personally incurred them, is revelatory of how the ethos of the fund was informed by the ideal of a collective responsibility of care in Auroville for members of the community. Something that Arthur underscored in saying, in the Auroville community, if you have an economic problem, it is not your problem. It is a problem for the community to take responsibility for. Managing the fund in a way that was responsive to the unique situations of individuals, rather than by arbitrary rules, is demonstrative of the subjective objectivity that is threaded through much of Auroville's administrative practice, inspired by the mother's anarchic statements that there would be no fixed rules framed for the community, and that a diversity of individual expressions would be upheld within it. Seed's financial health allowed for this flexible administration, because over the years a considerable credit had built up from unused monthly budgets, and from additional funds people would deposit into it. The collective generates money, Arthur affirmed. No one is left in need. It covers the needs of those who would not be able to do so individually, and it builds up credit. This credit was so significant that a savings account, Sangha, community in Sanskrit, had been created alongside the seed current account. In addition to subsidizing the regular living expenses of some, the savings of seed were used to fund special needs of members, and even to grant significant interest-free loans to Auroville projects and services that members were involved in. This is especially significant to note in connection with Elinor Ostrom's work on reclaiming the commons, which demonstrates that communal resources can be successfully managed and not fall prone to the free rider effect, contrary to what the tragedy of the commons theory suggests. Among the principles she defines as key for their effective maintenance are clear boundaries, such as membership, and clear monitoring, such as the tracking of expenditures, both of which were assured in the case of seed. Interestingly, Otto told me that he had at one point tried to strengthen the savings account by suggesting that people pool all of their money into it, but that it hadn't worked. Clearly, individuals only felt comfortable experimenting with a part of their individual wealth in this communal exercise, something that reflects an overarching trend in Auroville. Many members, both Indian and non-Indian, keep a significant portion of their wealth in bank accounts or assets outside of the community. Some feel we should all invest individual financial assets into our community accounts in solidary support of our economy. But most who have the possibility prefer to ensure their continued financial independence from the community by investing significant amounts outside of it. This capacity to define one's balance between individuality and community I consider to be one key to the overall success of the Auroville community in terms of longevity, in light of the scholarship on intentional community that identifies the curtailing of individual freedoms as detrimental for members in the long term, sometimes leading to the collapse of communities. Interestingly, when I asked whether there were any guidelines regarding what people could spend money on, Otto said, no, because people have different needs, adding, ashram needs are not the same needs, but we don't want to be like the ashram. This last statement underscores how Aurovillians embody the ideal of unity and diversity, of affirming individual freedom within the framework of community, and how important this is in distinguishing themselves from other types of intentional communities that insist on commonality, achieved through adherence to rules. Circles. A first attempt at scaling the practice of common accounts. The success of SEED drew the attention of the chairman of the Auroville Foundation, the legal entity that was created to formally recognize the community under India's Human Resources Ministry. Kirit Joshi suggested that the SEED experiment be scaled up through multiplication in the community. This recommendation coincided with a feeling within the community of being off track with our collective economy, one that was resurgent during my fieldwork period. A series of community-wide meetings ensued, in which Aurovillians explored the possibility of creating several common accounts, which were called circles. The circles experiment started out full of people, idealism, enthusiasm. But despite the fact that this top-down suggestion was embraced within the community, it failed to successfully take root. Otto said it was because it doesn't work with people who have nothing to do with each other. He told me that most circles fell apart in 6 months to a year, that some of them never even started because they got stuck in endless discussions, trying to agree on the conditions for their circle. For it to work, there has to be trust, Otto emphasized, adding that the SEED group hardly ever meets because it's not needed. We've known each other for 30 years. One circle, Maheshwari, does still exist today. Just like SEED, it has no rules about personal expenditures, except for one, that members purchase and consume at Auroville Enterprises, because the whole thing was about supporting the collective economy. Although Rebecca remarked it was not a rule, but an understanding, we were close-knit. Trust and affinity were thus key for the success and longevity of both Seed and Maheshwari. Unlike Seed, Maheshwari did not even track individual expenditures. Rebecca said she felt it was antithetical to the idea of a common pot. Only when the account went into minus did they check, to understand why. Because members trust each other, they do not worry that money is being misspent. However, this was not always the case. When they started out, the expenditures of some of the members were unacceptable to the group at large. One example was the purchase of a car, a luxury item in India at the time. Another, the use of the common account to finance a large loan on new property. While the members were never formally expelled from the circle, there were numerous heated and emotional discussions related to their spending, and they eventually left the group. More than one circle faced the issue of significant differences in how members related to the accounts. Some with aspirations for free money, while others, very idealistically, gave everything they had. Arthur, the administrator of Seed, considered the circle's experiment flawed because these common accounts were perceived by many as a way to increase their purchasing power, rather than as tools for the development of individual and collective consciousness. Siobhan, a member of the New Dawn Circle, felt that many of those who did approach these idealistically were let down, and that this happened too many times. New Dawn Circle had, according to her account, worked very well for 2 to 3 years until it ended with a crash, when one member bankrupted the common pot. He decided to leave the community, purchasing expensive clothes and shoes before doing so, and leaving his teenage daughter behind for the group to support financially. She nonetheless considers the circles to have been a useful experiment, because it was a, quote, lively process of people coming together for interesting discussions and ideas for an internal and in-kind economy for Auroville. A collective learning process, which, as we shall see, was prefigurative of a successfully institutionalized communal accounting system, the basis of the community provisioning service Portuguese Distribution Center. She also emphasized the learning aspect of the New Dawn Circle at an individual level, relating it to the prefigurative process of becoming Aurovillian. She highlighted how participating in such an experiment required Aurovillians to, quote, lose the sense of personal possession, a line from the mother's text, to be a true Aurovillian. This required a change of consciousness, Siobhan remarked, thus pinning the potential of such an experiment to succeed on the evolution of spiritual consciousness that Integral Yoga was predicated upon. Unfortunately, New Dawn failed to safeguard itself from the lack of consciousness of just one of its members, and thus failed as a discrete common account, a high price to pay for a group experiment. How effective of a tool it was for members to develop that change of consciousness, however, would be difficult to ascertain. Prosperity. Connecting common accounts experiments with social services. The next common account experiment I would like to briefly examine is the shared savings account Prosperity, which was founded in 2006 after the collapse of the Circle's experiment by the group of Aurovillians who concurrently established the Portuguese Distribution Center, a cooperative grocery service, which will be explored in detail in the subsequent section. Members of Prosperity contribute a small, standard monthly amount into the fund, from which they can seek financial support in times of need for expenditures incurred at designated Auroville services that provide for basic needs, thus beginning to explore an institutionalized collective provision for basic needs. My conversation with its administrator, Arthur, the same person who managed the Common Account Seed, revealed once again a resistance to bureaucratization. I was trying to understand how Prosperity worked in practice, and asked whether people came to him with bills from one or more of the services to be paid out of the fund. Arthur virtually bounded, responding in volley, "I don't need the bill. Sometimes people offer it to me, but I don't want it. The idea is not to check. It's not an insurance. That's not the idea at all. If members had to be policed, the project was pointless as an experiment in prefiguring a spiritualized society, which, as Arthur shared with me, Sri Aurobindo had envisaged would develop subjective forms of communal organization. Instead of being based on objective and uniformly imposed rules, these would be responsive to the spiritual evolution of individuals and thus able to foster the spiritual evolution of a collective. Prosperity for everyone, there's no point in creating it because it already exists, with policies which are detestable but indispensable. Administrators become cops. There is no point in that. He explained that such subjective experiments could not be forced into being. They had to correspond with the perceptions and experiences of those participating within them. For this reason, just like seed, prosperity is not advertised. For a decade, the fund covered all member requests without running into financial issues, with no policy for how much any individual could claim. In 2017, the fund collapsed, and Arthur asks himself why this happened. Because the prices have increased? Because people consumed more? His questions sound both genuine and rhetorical at the same time. I think maybe people started using it as an insurance, he said, by which I assume he meant taking advantage of an opportunity to be refunded, rather than reserving this for times of need. The downside is that few people participate in these kinds of collective economic experiments because they're not interested, he remarked, as our conversation drew to a close. That's my assumption. You'll be able to tell me what you found at the end of your research. Portuguese Distribution Center. I turn now to Portuguese Distribution Center, PTDC, as an Auroville service that has effectively institutionalized the socioeconomic ideals and shared accounting systems of the various small-scale experiments in common accounts. It is interesting to consider, given its significantly more important scale and degree of formalization as a public service, and the prefigurative process it is in turn fostering at an institutional level within the community. The emergence of PTDC. Just like the first common accounts, PTDC emerged in protest of a socio-economic trajectory that was perceived as antithetical to Auroville's collective ideals. In the early 2000s, funding for a new facility for Portuguese, the historical provisioning service for members of the community, prompted a group of about 10 concerned individuals, including my mother, to gather and reflect on how this new outlet could be run in a way that would reaffirm Auroville's evolution towards the communal economy envisaged by the mother, in which Aurovillians would give what they could in terms of work and involvement and have their basic needs met without the exchange of money through centrally supported services. They felt compelled to do so because the existing institution, which had started out as a solidary common pot, had devolved into an ordinary profit-making shop, which they felt deeply disappointed by. 30 years to arrive to the point where we were just selling and buying to each other, one of the members exclaimed to me. While the existing Portuguese was located in the current outskirts of the community, the new site was centrally located in its service area, a complex of services that included the community kitchen, the solar kitchen, Nandini, a clothing and linen service, the free store, and ServiceLink, the central administrative hub of services. The PTDC group, composed of several members of the Auroville Board of Services, felt that the existing Portuguese model would be incongruent with the ethos of these other services, in addition to being incongruent with the socioeconomic ideals of Auroville in general, and feared that, quote, if we were not going to run this outlet as a community service without the exchange of money, because it was at the center of Auroville, we could say goodbye to Auroville as a society without the exchange of money, where people are supported, they give what they can in terms of work and involvement, and they receive what they need without exchange of money, which is what it's supposed to be. At the same time, Portuguese, despite being registered as a self-supporting service, a solidary outfit that provides for everyday needs of the community, levying only enough to cover its cost of operation and development, was in fact generating a substantial profit. This was a significant breach of ethics because its profit was being derived from charging Aurovillians a markup for basic needs, which should be provided for with no exchange of money, according to the community's ideals. At the time of my doctoral research, a review and reform of the service, renamed the Portuguese Purchasing Center, was being undertaken by the community's key economic groups, the BCC and FAMC. The PTDC group sought to elaborate guidelines that would more closely reflect the community's socioeconomic ideals. In brief, the concept was that PTDC would operate as a cooperative, in which members would contribute a certain amount monthly and then take whatever they felt amounted to their basic needs. The service would be centrally supported and not self-supporting, meaning that the cost of operation, such as the overhead expenses and the maintenances of Aurovillians working in the service, would be borne by the collective, the central fund administered by the BCC. The group presented the concept to the BCC in 2005, with 160 people ready to participate in the experiment. The request was strongly challenged by the BCC, or economy group at the time, for a number of reasons. One was the concern that fully supported services were too much of a drain on the collective economy. Self-supporting services were preferable. Another was that the PTDC model, which was based on membership, did not warrant collective funds. Furthermore, it was anticipated that the model of participation would be abused. People would take more than they contributed, the service would end up financially overdrawn, and the central fund would be compelled to bear the cost. After many difficult meetings, the BCC decided to award the new Portuguese a small budget, 38,000 rupees, and a time for experimentation. The service began to operate in 2006, with many involved in running it doing so on a voluntary basis, and membership more than doubled in the first year. At the end of the first year, in 2007, the Economy Group, or BCC, called for a general meeting to determine whether the experiment should continue to run and be supported by the Central Fund. According to the group active in launching PTDC, the Economy Group was certain the outcome of the meeting would be to end the PTDC experiment, and that was their motive for calling it. However, the community at large ended up resonating with the PTDC project. What works in Auroville is when you have actually a small group of people who are cognizant of what they are doing and who really try to work it out in detail and come to the community with something that makes sense and that's congruent with what Auroville is supposed to be, is understanding of the possibilities and limitations of today and is able to come up with a project that can stand. And if you do that, you have people behind you, because you still have a majority of people in Auroville who really come for these ideals. So when something happens like that, there is a resonance. There was a resonance in that meeting. It was like, yeah, this is what we want. PTDC 2018. I began researching PTDC in 2016, a decade after it was founded. At the time of writing, PTDC operates as a centrally supported service with a recurring budget for its running expenses allocated by the BCC from the community's Communal fund. Its membership in 2018 was 1,500 people, which represents the majority of the Auroville population. They are called participants, emphasizing that this is a participatory, collective experiment, language that is drawn from a statement the mother made about Auroville, quote, "All who live there will participate in its life and development." The physical space was intentionally designed with all shelving along the walls and a largely free and empty space in the middle, consciously avoiding conventional supermarket rows that do not invite people to pause or interact comfortably with others, to create instead an informal community meeting space. Interaction between participants is the norm, many greeting one another with affection and entering into conversation ranging from personal matters to those of concern in community life and functioning. How does PTDC operate in practice? PTDC is open to Aurovillians, newcomers, and long-term volunteers, and has only in the last year begun refusing new members, because lack of human resources and the current accounting system make it challenging to continue to scale. As per PTDC's original guidelines, participants choose from one of 3 standard monthly contributions as approximates their needs. But in practice, these contribution amounts are flexible. The funds are collected into a single common account named Prosperity and are used to purchase a range of items according to certain criteria that correspond to the category of basic needs, are affordable in the Auroville context, and reflect conscious consumer choices such as healthiness, quality, and eco-friendliness. Auroville products are prioritized, and several Auroville commercial units offer their products at a cost price or on a discounted basis. The quote, spirit of service is a key criteria for the acceptance of items proposed by Auroville units or Aurovillian homemade products. PTDC avoids carrying goods whose price is inflated in order to derive profit on purchase, as this goes against the ideals of service and fraternity that were at the core of the cooperative. Participants may select any of the items available in the cooperative, and PTDC offers a small range of items per category in an attempt to strike a balance between meeting people's needs without imposing uniformity, while at the same time not encouraging a consumer society. This harks back to Auroville's ideal of collectivity, based on Sri Aurobindo's conception of unity and diversity, and the Mother's statement that the community is responsible to provide for its members on the basis of minimum needs. While being a common fund, as Portuguese originally was, it is far more flexible in how it meets the needs of individuals, who can choose whatever they would like to take instead of receiving a standard basket of provisions. Members are expected to contribute in relationship to their usage, which is posted 3 times a month on the public notice board at the entrance of the cooperative on the 16th, 26th, and last day of each month. Usage represents the tally of the rupee cost of the items selected by the participant to date, which is tracked at a checkout counter, although no itemized statements are provided. The rupee cost of items are not displayed on the shelves because the service would like people to focus on their needs, without their perception of these being influenced by the price of items, in addition to emphasizing that none of the items are on sale, an important ideological point the service wishes to make, given the Mother's statement that there ought to be no internal exchange of money in Auroville. One of the key criteria for the selection of items available at PTDC is affordability, so that individuals subsisting on the modest Auroville maintenance, the economic demographic PTDC is designed to serve, would be able to provide for their daily life while remaining within their PTDC contribution budget. However, a binder with a pricing list for all PTDC items is available for people to consult, and those who find themselves overdrawn can request to assess their itemized consumption costs with the PTDC managers to address this. Participants who regularly overuse are contacted throughout the year and requested to refund the service. Certain people with scarce financial means try to avoid raising the monthly contribution, even if their consumption often overshoots it, preferring to pay back the service the exact amount they owe in the hopes of saving money. The service, however, tries to discourage this pattern, both because it goes against PTDC's collective economic ethos and because it makes for more complex accounting. When collective usage is higher than collective contributions, the service does also appeal to all participants to make an additional donation if they can afford to, so that these excesses can be collectively subsidized. There are participants who intentionally choose to make monthly contributions that are higher than their relative consumption, because they know that this will subsidize those that are struggling financially, and feel positively when their monthly contribution exceeds their use. I couldn't care less at the end of the month when my balance is positive, that it goes to the common pot. I find that fantastic. It's no longer me or you. We are one. We are one. It's the collective. PTDC has only had to ask a handful of participants to leave the service in its decade-plus history. In one PTDC support group meeting I attended, the topic of termination of membership was raised. The manager hesitantly asked about the group's view on a few individuals who were consistently overusing and failing to reimburse the service, quickly adding, "I don't like termination. Do we give them more time?" Apparently, the group already had raised this issue with these participants several times to no avail, pointing out that if the reasons were financial difficulty, they had in the past figured out how to help with that. They decided to give those individuals a few months' notice before ending their membership and to invite them to reapply after 6 months. The same meeting had also been called to discuss the case of a PTDC participant who had requested to be refunded 8,000 rupees worth of unused contribution the previous year, something that had never happened before and shocked the team for its breach of understanding of the principles of the service. Later, I remarked to my mother, one of the founders of the service, that there seemed to be quite a few members of PTDC who were not interested in it as a socio-economic experiment, but because it was cheap and centrally located. "Yes," said Nicole. "When Jocelyn and I first started PTDC, it was very important to us that only people who were in it for the socio-economic experiment aspect become members. But others believed in strength in numbers. It's one of the ways to measure success." Unlike Seed and other common accounts that could select members, as a public service, PTDC is a mass common account project. In light of the dissatisfaction of some with the pooling of resources aspect of PTDC, however, the team is considering whether an eventual second location should operate as a standard capitalist shop with individual purchasing, while retaining nonetheless its non-profit nature. In the existing PTDC, only those members who are explicitly interested in the shared account experiment would remain, which the team hopes would enable them to develop it further together. To what extent is PTDC prefigurative in the Auroville context? To what extent is PTDC prefigurative of Auroville's socioeconomic ideals? Opinions differ among its participants. Some feel that it represents a significant step towards the future of the Auroville economy in terms of the realization of its ideals, whereas others challenge its economic model as a step towards a collective economy with no exchange of money. Uma, a member of one of Auroville's economic think tanks, feels that PTDC, in successfully institutionalizing the previous rounds of experimentation around shared accounts, has, quote, managed to make a certain entry into that new economy and held it. And made it work, and made it really work. It has crossed over the survival crunch. It has landed in the consciousness of people. Anne, who had managed Portuguese from 1983 to 1990, during its phase of transition from a collective to an individual basis of provisioning, considers PTDC to be, quote, the future of the Auroville economy. In any case, of what I call the base economy, food, education, health. And I think PTDC will one day cover all this and perhaps even go further. I don't yet have the vision of that. I'm not an economist. But for me, it is obvious that PTDC is that, something that brings us together, that unifies us. Others, however, fail to see how the economic model of PTDC is prefigurative of an economy with no exchange of money, in which people's needs are assured by the collective. Each person contributes in money, and their consumption is individually tracked on the basis of the rupees cost of the items they select. They are expected to contribute more if their individual expenditure does not meet their budget, and thus they consider the experiment to be flawed and even hypocritical. Many people, however, once they established what their monthly budget was on average, no longer worried about their consumption. They enjoy not having prices foregrounded and do not track their expenditure. According to Arthur, most members of Seed also have no idea what their current balance in the common account is at any given time. What they know is he is taking care of monitoring it for them in relation to the balance of the account as a whole, and feel that letting go is beautiful. While some PTDC participants would find it preferable to not have any individual tracking whatsoever because they consider it antithetical to the idea of a collective economy, others consider that having PTDC take care of monitoring expenditure on their behalf is actually a step towards a communally organized economy, and that being reminded of the limits of their budget is, quote, necessary at this stage of our consciousness, as very few of us may claim that they will take only what they absolutely need. Anandi, the PTDC manager, recognizes that asking people to base their choice on need and not on prices is challenging for many at a psychological level. How much do you take when you don't need to look at prices? What is it that you need? How do you react when you are confronted with that shelf, which doesn't say any price? She points out that when people begin their membership and she asks them what their monthly budget is, most don't know, even though they have been shopping at outlets with prices till then. To her, that is an indication that pricing each item does not actually amount to one being conscious of one's expenditure, despite some participants' exhortations of the contrary. Rather than limiting their capacity to be conscious, some participants argue that it forces them to be. Quote, "It forces us. This is the part that interests me the most. It forces us to be conscious about what we are doing. There are people who complain afterwards saying, how come you don't show the prices? It's up to us to be conscious. And why do I like this PTDC? It's that. It's an adventure also of consciousness." In this way, PTDC is also about unlearning old patterns and relearning new ones, which, as Siobhan had highlighted in the New Dawn Circle experiment, is key to the project of Aurovillians becoming more conscious. That said, members who are financially stressed do not have as much economic and psychological freedom to experiment with doing so in practice, even if they align with the ideals in principle. Prefiguring institutional economic relationships. A key dynamic that has been noted by those involved in the cooperative movement is how much solidarity is generated between cooperatives, and that this prefigures alternative socioeconomic relationships that are not predicated on profiteering from competitiveness. One important aspect to consider in the PTDC experiment is that it fosters relationships with Auroville's commercial units that prefigure Auroville's ideals for its economic organization. It has also formed solidarity relationships with non-Aurovillian suppliers whose ethos resonate with that of PTDC and of the Auroville community at large, and who sell their goods to the PTDC at a discounted rate. Several of Auroville's commercial units contribute their products to the service at cost price because it operates on a zero profit basis and caters exclusively to community members. The executives of Maroma, the highest contributing commercial unit to the community since it was founded in the 1970s, highlight PTDC's unique role and potential in Auroville's communal economy thanks to this model, noting that PTDC has offered them a channel through which they can contribute their products to the community at cost price, where no other such platforms exist. Margarita, an executive of MG EcoDuties, an Auroville unit that develops environmentally friendly soaps and household detergents and supplies these at cost to PTDC, says she does so because she strongly believes in a gift economy for Auroville, and PTDC is creating a paradigm shift in this regard, as it is a model based on values of the gift economy and not on a capitalistic system. These and other executives with profitable businesses expressed that they foresaw donating their products to PTDC in the future. In this way, PTDC prepares for what could eventually become a service that not only does not sell products to Aurovillians, but also does not buy them from Auroville units, thereby realizing the community's economic ideal of operating with no exchange of money. One could envisage that commercial units that would not be able to donate their products in addition to their financial contribution to the central fund would account for these as in-kind community contributions, a mechanism that already exists for other communal provisions. Although, as one unit executive pointed out, only few commercial units produce basic goods items that would be of use to the community, others could contribute in cash towards the purchase of such items that may be lacking. It bears noting that Portuguese in its infancy set the precedent for the practice of units contributing towards the collective. Claire Fanning had reached an agreement with all Auroville units that they could contribute a certain percentage to it directly. It also aligns with the Mother's directive for the participation of industries in Auroville. Quote, "The industries will participate actively. They will contribute. If they are industries providing articles that aren't in constant need, and are therefore in amounts or numbers too great for the township's own use, so that they will be sold outside, those industries must naturally participate through money. And I take the example of food. Those who produce food will give the township what it needs, in proportion to what they produce, of course, and it is the township's responsibility to feed everyone." This could form part of an evolution away from an individual and towards a communal responsibility for the provision of the basic needs of community members, as she intended. The PTDC management hopes to support such a trend, envisaging that the central fund could allocate a basic needs contribution for community members at the cooperative, now that a collective budget has been ascertained through the use of one account for purchase of goods. This is already being partially prefigured by some participants having their PTDC contribution allocated to a cooperative from the cash and/or in-kind portion of their maintenance before the latter is dispersed to their individual accounts. Conclusion: approximating a spiritualized society. The series of common accounts experiments leading up to and including PTDC have clearly been sites of prefigurative utopian practice, in which Aurovillians have attempted to concretize the community's founding socioeconomic ideals, such as providing for Aurovillians' basic needs collectively and eliminating the exchange of money between Aurovillians. These initiatives were driven by community members who, disappointed with the status quo of Auroville's collective economy, sought to reclaim the community's socioeconomic development, thus enacting a critical, prefigurative utopianism. While I have focused in the second section of this chapter on the example of PTDC, because of how dynamic and contested an experiment it is, and the critical mass of people that participate in it, there are many other services and other institutionalized experiments that similarly base themselves on concretizing Auroville's socioeconomic ideals. In the same service area complex that houses PTDC, there is a clothing, linens, and tailoring service, Nandini, founded in 1994. Just like PTDC, its operational costs are subsidized by the central fund. It undertakes bulk purchasing with member contributions, individuals take what they need, and their consumption is tracked. Another example is the Free Store, situated in between PTDC and Nandini, a center for donated items that is open for all Aurovillians and newcomers to take whatever they wish to, free of cost, as the service's costs of operation are financed by the central fund. And in two recent Aurovillian housing projects, Citadine and Sunship, approximately half of the apartments are allocated for free to people with no means, their cost absorbed by premium contributions made by individuals to inhabit the other half, successfully implementing fraternal models for wealth sharing to provide for the basic need of shelter. Citizens throughout the world who, by setting up such cooperative community institutions, have participated in, quote, the provision of general interest services not provided by either the market or the government, have been theorized as enacting an active citizenship. In the context of Auroville, I consider this activism to be prefiguratively utopian, as community members engaged to intentionally shape their society in the present and for the future, according to the community's socioeconomic ideals. The associations that have developed in this process have evolved from private to public sphere projects, increasing in scale and institutionalization. As such, they affirm the political potential of enacting what Sargison terms a transgressive utopianism, one that seeks to reformulate the public sphere according to private sphere practices. Retaining their participatory and experimental character, they continue to act as prefigurative spaces in which new, solidary, socioeconomic relationships are intentionally fostered and effectively concretized within the community and even beyond it, as evidenced in PTDC's institutional partnerships. PTDC manager Anandi points to how critical these kinds of prefigurative institutions that facilitate the concretization of Aurovillians' aspirations in everyday community life are for manifesting Auroville as an enacted utopian community. I've seen here so much goodwill. Where would that goodwill have been expressed if Portus would not have been there? In the supermarket, getting a beer? So not only you create a space where that can happen, it invites. And that for me is very important. If we don't create the space that calls for that, how are we expecting it to manifest? In a supermarket? That would be a real miracle. However, it is important to underline again that many Aurovillians remain critical of their socioeconomic achievements, as we saw in the case of PTDC, because they consider them to be only partial, and thus even hypocritical in light of the ideals they seek to prefigure. I draw on an observation by Arthur in reconciling these perceptions, which is that, quote, "In Sri Aurobindo's definition of a subjective society lies the key of Auroville." Sri Aurobindo described a subjective society as an intermediary stage, a passage from a society governed by ego to one governed by the divine, the Gnostic society. In that transitional period, bound to be uncomfortable, people would invent tools, means, frameworks that would contain elements of both, as prefigurative of the Gnostic society as possible, but still only approximating it.